Each day we grow in our simcha. And tonight, of course, we're going to talk this Shabbos, or we're going to read this Shabbos of Parshat, of the Parshiot on of Korbanot, and that's important. It's Sefer Vayikra, Parshat Vayikra. We're beginning a new Sefer, but what we're going to do tonight is prepare ourselves for Shabbat Zachor. Shabbat Zachor, as you know, is always the Shabbat just prior to Purim. And in it, in Shabbat Zachor, we read a very brief passage. This week, of course, we'll read Parshat Vayikra. We'll learn about the various different korbanot, the korban olah, the korban mincha, various different korbanot that we have. But we're going at the very end. We're taking out two Sifrei Torah, and we are then going to read from the second Sefer about Parshat Zachor, and we do it. It's a very brief passage. Today we're going to read. We'll start a little bit earlier. It is Parak Kaf Hey, Pasuk Yud Gimel. Parak Kaf Hey, chapter 25, Pasuk Yud Gimel 13, 25, 13. We're not going to read these first three psukim on Shabbos at all, not during the regular Kriya and not for Parshat Zachor. But these psukim are very instructional to us about learning how Chazal looked at the world and how they interpreted psukim. One of there are various different ways that they interpret psukim. And of course, those are listed. One of the ways that Chazal derive life lessons from the Torah is through what we call smichut. All right, the connection of psukim together that we don't necessarily see the connection. So they may be listed together. And therefore, Chazal tell us that we need to look for the commonality between the two. What do the two have in common? Now, let me first say, when it comes to historical events that occurred, so you're going to find if A happened on let's say in Nisan the 15th or the 20th, so the next event happened in Nisan 26th, so they'll be listed or recorded one after the other. But we're going to see here that we have a mitzvah lo ta'aseh, a mitzvah that urges us not to do an act which is wrong. And it's called lo ta'aseh. And the mitzvah, there are 365 lo ta'asehs and 248 mitzvot ta'aseh, positive commandments, put on tefillin, observe Shabbat, 248 of those. And there are 365, the number of a solar year, give or take a few hours, 365 lo ta'asehs, the Torah telling us, do not do this, do not murder, do not steal, do not wear shatnez. So all of those, the ones that are easily comprehended and those which are not so easily comprehended are listed. So, but when it comes to any of the 613 mitzvot, except for mitzvot that have to do, let's say, with Pesach or Sukkot, that are seasonal, or Shabbat, most mitzvot could be listed anywhere in the Torah. It could be listed in Sefer Devarim. It could be listed in Sefer Bamidbar, anywhere. So when we see a mitzvah, whether it's a mitzvah aseh, a mitzvah to do something, or a mitzvah lo ta'aseh, to avoid doing, when we see any of those, and then immediately after that, we have a recording of an incident, that makes us say, all right, the halacha could be anywhere. Why is it placed here? That's what we're going to look at first tonight as we prepare for Shabbat Zachor. Okay, And now we're going to see these psukim. Devarim 25:13. Lo yeh lecha b'chischa even va'aven. You are not to have, now nowadays, as you know, in Hebrew, the word kis means a pocket. But in the time of the Torah and in the time of the Chazal, there were no pockets to carry things that were inserted in clothing directly. So that's a relatively new invention. So a kis in the time of the Torah really would be to keep in a pouch. People had money pouches, and of course, those of us who have seen in the 17th century, 18th, 19th century, people engaged in any business deals. So if they're paying for something, they pull out the pouch, which may have been attached by a belt or something to their clothing. But the idea of a pocket, which is a clear part of clothing, that they didn't have. And what did they use for the pouch for? They used it to keep things usually that were important. Sometimes it's a matter of coins. Sometimes it's a matter of weights and measures. The Torah now is going to tell us the importance of the importance of ethical business dealings. And by the way, this is quite different from the other religions of the world. The Torah deals with us on a day-to-day basis as to how we are to conduct our lives. And day-to-day involves monetary issues. So the Torah begins here and it says, you may not have in your pouch two types of stones. Now, in those days, what they did is, let's say they dealt in kilos. I mean, we deal with either pounds or kilos, but let's take something like a kilo because most of the world deals with a kilo. And also its parts, the individual units are also easier to deal with. A kilo has 1,000 grams in it, 1,000 grams. So that's a nice even number. That's why it's called a kilogram. Kilo means 1,000. So a kilogram, or which is commonly called a kilo, has 1,000 grams. So let's assume that I walk into to a store 500 years ago, 300, 400 years ago. Or, by the way, in some stores in Mea Sha'arim, even to this day, what they have is an old-fashioned scale, which has a pole, usually a metal pole, not very high, all right? And on either side, you have containers. And when you put something in one container, which weighs a kilo, roughly 2.2 pounds, then if let's say I bought chicken. So if I put the chicken in the other one, if it's exactly a kilo, they will come out even. That's fine. And that's how they did it. Nowadays, we have digital scales. And by the way, people can still cheat on digital scales. I just spent one of numerous occasions in the doctor's office yesterday. So they weighed me. What do they use? They use this tall scale where they have these two buttons that when they reach a certain pounds and ounces, the scale goes up to the middle. It leaves, it is suspended, so to speak. That's how we know how much a person weighs or how much an article weighs. Good. Rather lengthy introduction, but you'll see why this is important. So in the olden days, what they did before any of these scales, they had the two-part containers in which you put a designated stone or metal piece of metal, which clearly had a weight to it. It could be a kilo, a half kilo, a quarter kilo, 500, 300 or 400 grams. It could be anything. Now, the Torah tells us that you're not allowed to have two separate types of stones. That means to say you can't have two sets of books. It has to be just, and it has to be one set of books. Now, what unscrupulous people would do, business people, what would they do? Before any of the customers come in, they have a stone that weighs a kilo, 1,000 grams. What do? They shaved off a little bit. 10 grams, 15 grams. So how are you going to know the difference between 1,000 grams and 985 grams? It's relatively small. I remember my parents and other people, a generation above me, would talk about keeping your thumb on the scale. That would make it look like it, that you have more than you have. So they would shave off a piece. It's called a kilo, but it's only 985 units or 985 grams. But the customer is paying for a whole kilo. Now, if that happens once, of course, it's insignificant. But what happens if it happens 100 times, 500 times? If it happens for a week, for a month, for a year? So the unethical business person save a lot of money for himself, and of course can accumulate money, which is actually, of course, stealing. So here we have very clear statement before the idea of the idea of Amalek, which we're going to see in a moment. That's what the Torah puts there. So we have to ask, how come? Why does the Torah place this mitzvah of ethical business practices, which could be placed anywhere? Oh my goodness, it could be placed anywhere, right next to Amalek. So you can probably, some of you right now, I'm sure, are guessing, and you may be at least partially right. Whether you have what Rashi says, we'll see. So therefore, the Torah then says in the next pasuk, you have to have a complete stone or a complete measuring implement. It must be complete. It must not be defective. Okay? And then the Torah says, Laman yarichu yamecha. Why? So that the days that you spend al ha'adama will be lengthened. They'll be full. It doesn't mean you're necessarily going to live long life. A person who has good business practices and ethical business practices is just doing what he or she should be doing. But the Torah tells us it's not just you. What happens if 100 people do this, 1,000 people? And everybody knows, no matter where they go, whether they go to buy wine or they go to buy meat or they go to buy some sort of an article, they know they're not going to get what they're paying for because everybody's unethical. So then the Torah says, then you won't be on the land long. That's why the Torah doesn't say that you're going to live, but that you, meaning collectively you as a nation, you will be able to live on this land in the entirety that you should, only if you and your neighbors conduct yourselves with ethical business. And then the pasuk says, Ki to'avat Hashem Elokecha kol oseh eleh, kol oseh amel. Now the word to'eva, usually if you ask people, they say, I know what a to'eva is. It's an abomination. The only problem is most of us don't know what an abomination is. We know it's bad. We just don't know what it is. So I would urge you to recognize that the idea of a to'eva, a person who acts this way without integrity in business, so that person commits an abomination. But here's what Chazal tell us an abomination is, in this case, a to'eva. The word ta'ov, tav, ayin, bet, which is the shorish of this word, it's the essential element, means to be distant. To be distant. Think about this. The Torah tells us when you're unethical in business, you become distant from a Kodesh Baruch. And now we do have several mitzvot that the Torah identifies as to'eva. We're not going to deal with them now, but clearly the to'eva here is people who act unethically. And of course, in every society we have it. And if enough people do it, then nobody trusts anybody, right? So then you need to know you're distancing yourself. Now the question is why? Why are we distancing ourselves? One simple answer is The whole idea of our relationship with God is emunah. We have an emunah, we have faith that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is just, and very often is some of the, as I learned when I grew up, my Rabbi and others would say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in charge of Parnasa. God takes authority, and he is in charge of each person's Parnasa. You're not going to get more than you should get, and you're not going to get less than you should get. I have to have an emunah when things don't go the way I thought they should. I have to have an emunah that God is in control, and that what I'm supposed to get, I will get. Now, there are people who act in an unscrupulous manner, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu sees that too. And it could well be that if I thought I was supposed to get more, and someone steals the money from me, I'm still getting only what I should get, but I know that this person is the instrument of that. And sometimes it's more, not less. So emunah is the essence that we have to have of our business, in our business dealings. And what was what was Amalek? Amalek, as you probably have heard, the gematria of Amalek is Suffolk, which means uncertainty. Amalek entered the world when all the rest of the world understood finally that there is a Borei Olam, there's a creator in the world, and that he watches the oppressed and cares for the oppressed. Even Mitzrayim, even Paro understood that in the end, except Amalek. Amalek said, let's test the waters. Let's see. Let's attack them and see. So now we're going to read these three psukim, and then we're going to come back to see why this halacha is attached to the incident. Torah tells us we have a mitzvah not to let more than a year go by. Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek. You must remember. It's a mitzvah all the time, but at least once in a 12-month year. And of course, this year, this would be 13 months because now we have it in the second month. So Chazal deal with that too, as to how we still fulfill the mitzvah of remembering Amalek each year, even though this year is 13 months, not 12, since the last time we read this parsha. Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek. Remember, as a community, it must be a collective memory. The Jewish people functions on collective memory. That we remember, we know, whether it's Amalek or whether it's Mitzrayim or whether it's the very fine things that people did for us. And we should never forget that. There were good things that our fellow humans have done, and we can't forget those either. But here there's a special mitzvah. Baderech, along the way, Mitzrayim. What did Korach do? What did Amalek do? Asher karcha baderech. He encountered you. He attacked you. There's various different views as to what he did, but in any case, it was a negative interaction. Vayezanev b'cha, he tailed you. The word zanav. He tailed you. He attacked you from behind. B'cha, against you. Kol anecha shalim acharecha. All the weak people. He attacked the weak, the vulnerable, the people who could not defend themselves, children, elderly people, the sick. That's whom he attacked. Ve'ata ayef v'yageya. And you were ayef. Ayef means weary, v'yageya. Or we could say actually tired, v'yageya, and weary. Being tired is a physical thing. Yageya is more of a psychological weariness. V'lo yarei Elokim, and he did not fear God. Now the question is, who didn't fear God? Well, your first thought is, well, it's probably Amalek. We never do anything, but it was Amalek. He didn't fear, and it makes sense. Remember what Amalek did? He attacked you, and you were weak, and you were weary. V'lo yarei Elokim, and he did not fear Hashem. And that makes sense, knowing the persona both collectively and individually. That's what Amalek was. But it's not so simple. It's a machloket rishonim. It's a disagreement among the commentators as to who didn't fear God. According to Rashi, it's as you and I just mentioned. Amalek, he attacked us. He didn't fear, and that's what allowed him he didn't fear HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so that's what allowed him to attack us, even though we did nothing to him. And so that makes sense. However, other Rishonim say, the Chizkuni, I believe, says, no, take a look at the pasuk and how it's constructed. Asher karcha baderech, he attacked you along the way. Vayizanev b'cha, he tailed you, from the word zanav, against you. Kol hanechashalim acharecha, all of the weak. Now, what does weak mean? Weak, of course, could be a physical weakness. It could be an emotional weakness, as we said. But maybe it was a spiritual weakness. All of the weak ones among you, you were both physically and emotionally tired, weary. You did not revel in the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had done all that he had done for you. V'lo yorei Elokim. And you didn't fear God as you should have, meaning to say the Jewish people as a whole. And so, but you'll say, well, but why would you say that? Well, if you look carefully in the pasuk, the way it's constructed, we look for antecedents. When it said, Lo yorei Elokim, it's did not fear God. The question is who? If you look at the last antecedent, meaning the last pronoun, it's ata. You didn't fear. You didn't fear God. You were weak. And so therefore, the Chizkuni says, no, it's referring to the Jews. The fact that we were spiritually weak allowed Amalek to get in the door and allowed him to attack us. And what happened then simply can be repeated over and over again. Our enemies can attack us when we are spiritually weak. And that's when we are the most vulnerable. And then, of course, the Torah tells us, we're going to come back in a second, but I do want to finish these three psukim. And then the Torah says, because if you remember them and you what they did, and you remember the lessons of Amalek, your own weakness and his failure to fear God, it will be when God allows you to be free of all of your enemies in the land of Eretz, so misaviv, in the very land, Eretz Canaan, Eretz Yisrael, which God has given you, Verishta, to inherit, meaning to say it'll go from generation A to B and to C, all the way throughout the Dorot, throughout the generations. So, Timched Secher Amalek. You have an ongoing obligation to eradicate the memory of Amalek, Litachat HaShamayim, from under the heavens, Lo Tishkach. What does it mean, Lo Tishkach? If you're going to remember, you don't forget. The answer is not forgetting is actually an active. It's an active thing. We forget things that aren't important to us. It is possible that we try not to remember things, of course, but usually when a person says, oh, I forgot, what they're really saying is, it wasn't high on my agenda. That doesn't mean it's bad, but it just means it wasn't high on my agenda. I forgot to get eggs. Okay, so you remember you're getting other things, forgot to get eggs. If you forget what Amalek did to us as a nation, them to us, so our forgetting means that it really wasn't a priority for us. And so therefore the Torah says, remember, you have to actively try to remember, lo tishkach, and you have to do what you need to do, not to forget. Now, I want to go back just to the pasuk before. That's all a Parshat Zachar, by the way. Just these three psukim, very powerful. And remember, it is a machloket, but it's machloket Rishonim. The Rishonim disagree, but at least some of them say this is a mitzvah doraita. You have to be in shul, well, if you can. If not, there are other remedies for it, but you should supposed to be there, and it's a mitzvah incumbent upon men and incumbent upon women to fulfill this mitzvah of eradicating Amalek. Now we go back to the question. So what's the connection between Amalek? Okay, fine, it happened here. But why is the halacha of business, honest and ethical business? Rashi sees it. Rashi quotes the Medrash, which says to us that if you are unethical in your business dealings, in other words, you are not faithful. And the Gemara in Shabbos tells us that one of the most important elements when we get to heaven is they're going to ask us when we get to Shemayim, Natata, right? Nasata v'natata be'amuna. Did you engage in business dealings be'amuna? Now, be'amuna could mean in good faith, and of course that's certainly an acceptable view, in good faith. But remember, what we said before is that our parnasa, we have an emuna that our parnasa comes from God. And so when we get to Shemayim, after 120 years, one of the 6 questions they ask you is nasata v'natata be'emuna. In your business dealings, was it with the idea, the belief that in the end it's up to God as to what will happen in business? God is in charge of parnasa. They're going to ask us that. If we cheat in business, if we deal unethically, whether it's by overcharging, or whether it's by giving inferior quality of that which we sell or purvey, or services that are inferior. So that means to say that is a defect in our emunah. And Purim is all about emunah. Purim is about emunah. God's name is not mentioned, but God's looking in the Megillah. God sees everything. The Megillah is the longest continuous story, 10 chapters. Every single incident is predicated on the prior one. Every single one throughout those chapters. That means to say God is watching, and sometimes he is the unseen, as Chazal say. He is the ro'eh ve'eino nireh. He is the one who sees, but isn't seen. And the Megillah, of course, is the greatest testimony to that. So people who are concrete and say, well, who's going to see, don't realize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the creator. He is the seer, but he is unseen. And so therefore, Rashi tells us, he brings the Medrash that says, if you deal unjustly in business, hevido egg, you need to worry about the attack of the enemy. Why? Because if we live in a society where we can't trust each other, we can't trust each other in business, we're always looking at the neighbor. The neighbor becomes my enemy. The person who works in the store, the person who works in the shopping center, all of that means that all of our focus is trying to protect ourselves from our very neighbors, the people whom we should trust. If that's the case, says the Medrash, you'll be too busy worrying about all the cheating, and you won't see that the real enemy, mibachutz, from the outside, that enemy is the one who could destroy. And so that's why they're put together. First, the Torah tells us business ethics. Emunah. If you don't deal with, in your business dealings with emunah, knowing that God is in charge of everything, then of course you really got what to worry about, because we see enemies everywhere then. Not only is the enemy outside, the enemy is in front of us. And therefore, we are ill-equipped to be able to protect ourselves. The last thing I want to say is that regarding Amalek, there can be a little bit of Amalek in anybody. There can be. Whenever we talk Lashon Hara about somebody, that's Amalek talking. Nobody gains from saying Lashon Hara. Nobody does it to get more money. Amalek attacked us for the sheer joy of attacking. Sadly, when we talk Lashon Hara or we engage in activities that hurt our neighbor and we don't gain anything from, I'm not saying we should do it and gain, but we don't gain from it, that's Amalek. And that doesn't mean we should call someone who talks Lashon Hara Amalek. But what it means is that's an Amalek-like behavior. And so therefore, we have to do everything we can to eradicate that so that the Avraham within us should overwhelm the Amalek type behavior. And that we should therefore extend ourselves and engage in Avat Yisrael. Now is the time especially to engage in Avat Yisrael. And to, especially when we know the world is in such a precarious position now. Innocent people all over it, a couple of 100,000 Jews in Ukraine, and not to mention many innocent people in Ukraine. They're in danger. We have to do what we can to alleviate that danger. For Jews, we have to do first, but there's no reason why we can't or shouldn't do both. I do want to end with one thing. I saw a very powerful news reel about what the Polish people are doing to welcome and to alleviate the suffering of the Ukrainians. Now, we're not going to get into look what they did. Yes, very often it was done. But now it is the Poles were not always welcoming, not most of the time, not welcoming to us. But we need to understand that right now, these people are doing something extraordinary. Everybody who comes from Ukraine gets a meal before they can even sit down. They give them a meal. They welcome them. They even give them SIM cards so they can use their cell phone. That is Avraham Avinu, even though they're not B'nai Avraham Avinu, but they're acting like Avraham Avinu. We have an obligation as well to do what we can to alleviate suffering, certainly first and foremost to our Jewish brothers and sisters, but not known without any exclusion to others who may be suffering and who are innocent. So I want to wish everybody, next week we will not be meeting. Next week, Wednesday night, will be Purim itself. So we'll see 2 weeks hence. And Emir Hashem, I wish everybody a very joyful Purim Sameach. And I hope that everybody will be able to fulfill the very important mitzvah of Zachor et asher asah lecha Amalek. Thank you very much, everybody. Have
Purim Sameach.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure. Purim Sameach.
Yashikah.
Baruch Tiyeh.